In the final months of World War II, beneath the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine fleet was fighting a losing battle. By 1945, what had once been one of the most advanced and diverse submarine forces in the world was being systematically hunted down and destroyed. This is the story of one such vessel, and the lone man who survived to tell what happened in those desperate final days of the war. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from history to life. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this remarkable tale of survival. The Japanese submarine fleet entered World War II as a technological marvel. By 1941, Japan had built some of the largest, longest-range submarines in the world. These weren't just military vessels. They were floating fortresses, some capable of traveling over 20,000 miles without refueling, carrying aircraft in watertight hangars, and staying at sea for more than 100 days. Japan built submarines that were larger than any diesel-electric submarine the world had seen, some exceeding 400 feet in length. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years perfecting these machines, creating vessels that could strike deep into enemy territory and disappear beneath the waves like ghosts. But by early 1945, everything had changed. The tide of war had turned decisively against Japan. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, island by island, pushing closer to the Japanese homeland. The once mighty combined fleet lay in ruins at the bottom of the ocean. And the submarine force, which had begun the war with such promise, was being hunted to extinction. The American Navy had developed sophisticated anti-submarine warfare tactics. They had sonar technology that could detect submarines from miles away. They had depth charges that could crush a submarine's hull like an eggshell. And they had aircraft equipped with radar that could spot a submarine's periscope breaking the surface even in the dead of night. For Japanese submariners in 1945, every patrol was potentially their last. One submarine that exemplified the desperate situation was I-13, a massive Type A modified aircraft-carrying submarine. She was over 350 feet long and could carry 2 seaplanes in a watertight hangar. In July 1945, I-13 was on a crucial mission, carrying vital supplies and personnel. Her captain knew the risks. American destroyers and aircraft were everywhere, prowling the waters between Japan and the far-flung outposts of the crumbling empire. On July 16, 1945, about 550 miles east of Yokosuka, I-13's lookouts spotted aircraft on the horizon. The submarine crash-dived, her crew scrambling to their battle stations as the vessel descended into the depths. But the Americans had already seen her. The destroyer escort USS Lawrence C. Taylor and aircraft from the escort carrier USS Anzio began their attack. Depth charges rained down, each explosion like a hammer blow against the submarine's hull. The lights inside the vessel flickered and died. Water began seeping through stressed seals. The crew knew what was coming. When I-13 was finally brought to the surface by the relentless depth charge attacks, American forces witnessed a scene of devastation. The submarine was torn apart, her crew perishing in what would become the single largest loss of life in the Japanese submarine force during the entire war. 140 men went down with that vessel, their bodies entombed in steel at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But I-13 was just one of many submarines lost in those final months. In June 1945, I-65, a Kaidai-Vi-type submarine, was depth-charged off Saipan by a U.S. Navy patrol bomber. The aircraft circled overhead, dropping depth charges with surgical precision. The submarine tried to evade, diving deeper, twisting and turning, but there was no escape. The ocean above erupted in massive columns of water as each depth charge detonated. Inside the submarine, the crew fought desperately to keep their vessel afloat, but the damage was too severe. She went down with all hands, another steel coffin on the ocean floor. Throughout 1945, Japanese submarines fell victim to American hunters with increasing frequency. Submarines like I-8, which sank in March off Okinawa. I-56 lost in April. I-44 missing near Okinawa in April, possibly brought down by aircraft. I-12 lost in the Central Pacific in January. Each loss represented not just a vessel, but dozens of trained submariners, men who had devoted their lives to serving their emperor and their nation. The Japanese submarine doctrine had been fundamentally different from that of American and German submarine forces. While the Germans focused on commerce raiding, attacking merchant convoys to strangle Britain's supply lines, and while Americans targeted both warships and merchant vessels with equal ferocity, the Japanese had focused primarily on attacking enemy warships. This fleet warfare doctrine meant that Japanese submarines often passed up opportunities to sink merchant ships, holding their torpedoes for engagements with cruisers, destroyers, and carriers. It was a strategy that proved tragically flawed as the war progressed. By 1945, many Japanese submarines had been modified to carry Kaiten, human-guided torpedoes. These were essentially piloted bombs, small submersible craft with a single operator who would guide the weapon directly into an enemy ship, giving up his life in the process. It was a weapon born of desperation, a reflection of how dire Japan's situation had become. Submarines like I-58, I-47, and I-53 were converted to carry these weapons, their aircraft hangars removed, to make room for the Kaiten and their pilots. The conditions aboard these submarines in their final days were beyond harsh. Food was scarce, often reduced to rice and whatever fish the crew could catch. Fresh water was rationed strictly. The air inside became thick and foul after days submerged, recycled through primitive scrubbers that could barely keep carbon dioxide levels manageable. Men sweated in the tropical heat when on the surface, then shivered in the cold when diving deep to escape detection. Sleep was taken in shifts on narrow bunks or on the deck, wherever space could be found. And always there was the fear, the knowledge that at any moment depth charges could begin raining down or a torpedo could slam into the hull. The psychological toll was immense. Young sailors, many barely out of their teens, lived with the constant awareness that they might never see their families again. Officers who had trained for years in the art of submarine warfare found themselves outmatched by an enemy with superior technology and unlimited resources. Veterans who had survived battles early in the war knew that their luck was running out. The waters around Japan had become a hunting ground, and they were the prey. Communication with naval headquarters became increasingly difficult as the war drew to a close. Submarines would surface at night to send and receive radio messages, exposing themselves to enemy radar for precious minutes, while encoded transmissions were sent and received. Sometimes headquarters would order submarines to undertake missions that everyone knew were suicide. Attacks on heavily defended anchorages, attempts to break through anti-submarine barriers that American forces had established, transport missions to isolated garrisons that had been cut off and were slowly starving. The submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, managed to survive the war, but her story illustrates the desperation of the final months. On July 30th, 1945, I-58 encountered the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, which had just delivered components for the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. Hashimoto fired 6 torpedoes, and 2 struck the American cruiser, sending her to the bottom in just 12 minutes. Over 800 American sailors perished in that attack and the subsequent days adrift in shark-infested waters. It was I-58's only significant victory of the entire war, despite multiple patrols. But even this success couldn't change the inevitable outcome. Japan was losing the war, and the submarine force was being annihilated. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Emperor Hirohito, announced Japan's surrender, fewer than a dozen Japanese submarines were still operational. The rest had been sunk, scuttled, or were trapped in port, unable to put to sea due to damage or lack of fuel. The surrender brought its own tragedies. Many submarine commanders, unable to accept defeat, chose to go down with their vessels. Some submarines were scuttled by their own crews in the final days of the war. Others surrendered to American forces and were later taken out to sea and sunk to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Submarines like I-400 and I-401, the massive aircraft-carrying behemoths that represented the pinnacle of Japanese submarine technology, were torpedoed by American submarines off Hawaii in 1946, their revolutionary designs destroyed to keep them out of Soviet possession. For the survivors of the submarine force, including men like Hashimoto, life after the war was complicated. Hashimoto was called to testify at the court-martial of Captain Charles McVeigh, the commander of USS Indianapolis. In a remarkable moment, the Japanese submarine commander testified that even if Indianapolis had been zigzagging as she should have been, he still would have been able to sink her. It was an act of integrity that transcended the enmity of war. Decades later, Hashimoto would work to help clear McVeigh's name, sending letters to American officials arguing that the American captain had been made a scapegoat for failures that were not his fault. The memories carried by submarine veterans were haunting. They remembered shipmates lost to depth charge attacks. They remembered the sound of a submarine's hull buckling under pressure, a sound like distant thunder that grew closer and louder until it became a deafening roar. They remembered the smell of fear and diesel fuel and unwashed bodies in a submarine that had been submerged for days. They remembered looking through periscopes at enemy ships, calculating firing solutions, launching torpedoes, and then diving deep to escape the inevitable counterattack. Some survivors spoke of the moment when depth charges would detonate close enough to throw men off their feet, when lights would shatter and equipment would come loose from bulkheads. They described how the submarine would shake like a living thing in agony, how leaks would spring open and crew members would rush to shore them up, while water sprayed into the compartments. They talked about listening to the sounds of their own damaged submarine, trying to determine if the groaning hull would hold or if the next depth charge would be the one that sent them to the bottom. The few who lived through the destruction of their submarines and made it to the surface faced their own horrors. In the middle of the Pacific, hundreds of miles from land, a man in the water had little chance of survival. Some were picked up by the very enemy ships that had sunk them, becoming prisoners of war. Others were never found, dying alone in the vast ocean. The lucky ones, the incredibly rare survivors, had stories that seemed almost impossible. Imagine being inside a submarine when it's hit by a torpedo or fatally damaged by depth charges. The vessel begins to flood. Compartments are sealed off, trapping men inside to drown as the submarine descends. In the chaos, if you're fortunate enough to be in a compartment near an escape hatch, you might have a chance. But submarine escape in 1945 was primitive and extremely dangerous. You had to flood your compartment, equalize the pressure, then open the hatch and swim to the surface, all while dealing with the effects of pressure change on your body, the cold of the deep ocean, and the fact that you might be surfacing miles from any rescue. Those who made it to the surface faced more challenges. Without a life raft, survival time in the Pacific was measured in hours, not days. The sun would beat down mercilessly during the day. At night, the temperature would drop and hypothermia would set in. Sharks, attracted by the commotion of a sinking ship, would circle. Thirst would become unbearable. The temptation to drink seawater, which would only hasten a person's end, was overwhelming. And then there was the psychological trauma of being the sole survivor when dozens of your comrades had perished. The guilt of living when so many had perished. The questions that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Why me? Could I have done something differently? Did I abandon my shipmates? These were burdens that survivors carried long after the war ended. The story of Japan's submarine force in World War II is one of technological ambition meeting strategic miscalculation. Japan had built incredible machines, submarines that were marvels of engineering, but they had used them incorrectly, focusing on fleet actions rather than the commerce rating that might have actually impacted the American war effort. They had trained skilled crews but sent them on missions that were increasingly suicidal as American anti-submarine capabilities improved. And by 1945, they were throwing away these valuable assets in desperate, futile attempts to turn the tide of a war that was already lost. The submarine I-58 survived the war and was surrendered to American forces. On April 1, 1946, in an operation called Road's End, she was towed out to sea near the Goto Islands and scuttled. American forces wanted to study Japanese submarine technology, but also needed to dispose of these vessels to make way for the post-war order. I-58 was stripped of useful equipment and sent to the bottom, joining so many of her sister ships on the ocean floor. The legacy of the Japanese submarine force is complex. On one hand, they achieved remarkably few successes compared to German and American submarine forces. Japanese submarines sank far fewer ships than their counterparts. Their strategic impact on the war was minimal. But this wasn't due to lack of courage or skill from the submariners themselves. It was a failure of doctrine and leadership. The men who crewed these submarines fought bravely, endured terrible hardships, and died in large numbers, serving a cause that was doomed from the start. Today, the wrecks of these submarines lie scattered across the Pacific Ocean floor. Some have been found by researchers and underwater archaeologists. Others remain lost, their final resting places unknown. They are graves for the men who served aboard them, steel monuments to a vanished era. When divers explore these wrecks, they find evidence of the final moments, hatches sealed shut, personal belongings scattered in compartments, the bones of men who went down with their ships. For the very few survivors who lived long enough to tell their stories, the memories never truly faded. They would dream of being back in that submarine, hearing the ping of enemy sonar, feeling the shock of depth, charges detonating nearby. They would wake up sweating, their hearts racing, transported back to that moment of terror beneath the waves. Some couldn't bring themselves to talk about their experiences for decades. Others felt compelled to share their stories, to honor the memory of those who didn't make it back. In the broader context of the war, the fate of the Japanese submarine force was emblematic of Japan's entire military situation in 1945. Outgunned, outproduced, and outmaneuvered, the Japanese military was fighting a war it could no longer win. Every day, more ships were sunk, more aircraft were shot down, more soldiers were lost in battles that served no strategic purpose except to delay the inevitable. The submarine force, once a source of pride and a symbol of Japanese technological prowess, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The end came swiftly once the atomic bombs were dropped and the Soviet Union entered the war. Emperor Hirohito's recorded message, broadcast across Japan, announced the surrender. For submarine crews still at sea, the news was devastating. Some commanders initially refused to believe it, thinking it must be enemy propaganda. But as confirmation came through official channels, they had no choice but to accept reality. The war was over. Japan had lost. The submarines that survived were ordered to surface, display white flags or other surrender markings, and proceed to designated ports where they would be turned over to Allied forces. For proud submarine officers who had spent years training to fight America and Britain, this was a humiliation almost beyond bearing. Some chose not to comply, instead scuttling their submarines and ending their own lives rather than surrender. Others followed orders, bringing their crews home alive, even though it meant giving up their vessels to the enemy. In the aftermath of the war, most Japanese submarines met the same fate. They were studied briefly by American and British naval engineers who were impressed by some aspects of their design, particularly the large aircraft-carrying submarines. but ultimately they were considered surplus. In operations like Rhodes End and Bottom, dozens of Japanese submarines were taken out to sea and sent to the bottom. Some were torpedoed. Others were used for target practice by ships and aircraft. A few were simply opened to the sea and allowed to flood and sink. The men who had crewed these submarines faced difficult years ahead. Many returned to a Japan that was devastated by years of war, her cities in ruins, her economy shattered. They found that their military service, once a source of honor, was now something many Japanese preferred not to discuss as the nation grappled with defeat and occupation. Submarine veterans, like other military men, had to find new purposes in a country that was being rebuilt from the ground up under American occupation. Some former submariners found work related to their technical training, working in Japan's nascent post-war industries. Others struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by their wartime experiences. A few, like Commander Hashimoto, wrote books about their experiences, trying to make sense of what they had been through and to honor the memory of those who had perished. These accounts provide invaluable historical records of what life was like aboard Japanese submarines during the war. As the years passed and memories faded, the full story of Japan's submarine force in World War II began to be told more completely. Historians accessed Japanese records that survived the war, interviewed veterans while they were still alive, and researched Allied accounts of submarine engagements. What emerged was a picture of a force that had enormous potential, but was hampered by strategic mistakes, technological limitations in some areas despite advances in others, and ultimately by the overwhelming industrial and military superiority of its enemies. The lonely survivor of a submarine sinking carries a unique burden. Unlike survivors of surface ships who often numbered in the dozens or hundreds and could support each other in processing their trauma, a sole submarine survivor has no one who shared that exact experience, no one else who was in that particular steel tube when it was torn apart. No one else who can truly understand what it was like in those final moments. This isolation adds another layer of difficulty to processing such extreme trauma. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts on the experiences of these submarine crews, and let us know if you'd like to hear more stories from the underwater war in the Pacific. Your engagement helps this channel grow and allows us to continue bringing these important historical accounts to a wider audience. The technological aspects of Japanese submarines deserve mention. While they lagged behind in some areas like radar and sonar, they excelled in others. Japanese torpedoes, particularly the Type 95, were among the best in the world. They used oxygen instead of compressed air, which left almost no wake, making them difficult to spot and avoid. Japanese submarine construction incorporated lessons learned from German and British designs, but added unique Japanese innovations. The I-400 class submarines, with their aircraft hangars and catapults, represented a unique approach to submarine warfare that no other nation had attempted on such a scale. But technological excellence meant nothing when the submarines couldn't survive long enough to use their advantages. American anti-submarine warfare improved dramatically over the course of the war. Early in the conflict, Japanese submarines had considerable success. As the war progressed, however, American forces learned to track submarine movements, predict their patrol routes, and set up ambushes. The development of hunter-killer groups combining destroyers and escort carriers proved devastating to Japanese submarines. These groups would actively hunt submarines rather than simply defending convoys, and they were terrifyingly effective. The human cost of submarine warfare was staggering on all sides. German U-boats suffered a 75% casualty rate among their crews, the highest of any military unit in the war. American submarines lost 52 boats during the war, with over 3,500 men perishing, and Japanese submarines fared no better, with the majority of their fleet destroyed and thousands of submariners lost. It was one of the most dangerous assignments in any navy, and the men who volunteered for submarine service knew the risks. Training for submarine service was rigorous in the Japanese Navy. Men had to demonstrate technical proficiency, the ability to remain calm under pressure, and the capacity to live in extremely close quarters with dozens of other men for weeks or months at a time. The selection process weeded out those who couldn't handle the psychological stresses of submarine duty. Those who made it through training were considered elite sailors, specialists in a form of warfare that required a unique combination of skills. Life aboard a submarine in wartime was a strange mixture of tedium and terror. Days or weeks might pass with nothing happening, the submarine cruising on the surface or submerged, searching for targets. Then suddenly, enemy ships would appear and the crew would leap into action. Battle stations, diving, calculating, firing solutions, launching torpedoes, evading counterattacks. Every man had to perform his duties perfectly because one mistake could doom the entire boat. The social dynamics aboard a submarine were unique. Officers and enlisted men lived in closer proximity than on any surface ship. The captain might be mere feet away from the newest recruit. Everyone ate the same food, breathed the same recycled air, and shared the same dangers. This created a sense of unity and shared fate that was different from other military units. When a submarine was lost, it wasn't just the officers who were mourned or just the enlisted men. It was the entire crew, remembered as a single unit that had lived and died together. For families back in Japan, waiting for news of submarines that never returned was agonizing. Unlike surface ship losses, which were often widely reported, submarine losses frequently went unconfirmed for months or even years. A submarine would simply fail to return from patrol, and after a certain time period elapsed, it would be declared missing and presumed lost. Families would receive notification that their loved ones were gone, but often with no information about how or where or when. This uncertainty made the grieving process even more difficult. The strategic failure of Japan's submarine force can be traced to several factors. The doctrine of attacking warships rather than merchant vessels meant that submarines were often taking on heavily defended targets while ignoring easier prey. The refusal to adopt the kind of wolf-pack tactics that made German U-boats so effective meant that Japanese submarines typically operated alone, making them more vulnerable. And the diversion of resources to build and operate the massive aircraft-carrying submarines, while technologically impressive, resulted in fewer conventional attack submarines that might have had greater impact. Another factor was the deteriorating quality of Japanese submarine crews as the war progressed. Early in the war, submarines were crewed by well-trained, experienced men. As casualties mounted, replacements were often hastily trained, lacking the experience and skills of those they replaced. By 1945, some submarines were crewed by men who had only a few months of training, sent into combat against an enemy that had years of experience in anti-submarine warfare. It was a recipe for disaster. The final months of the war saw Japanese submarines used in increasingly desperate ways. Some were converted into cargo carriers attempting to resupply isolated garrisons. This was a terrible waste of sophisticated attack submarines, but it reflected how dire Japan's situation had become. With surface shipping almost entirely destroyed by American air and submarine attacks, submarines were among the few vessels that had any chance of breaking through to deliver supplies. But they were ill-suited for this role, carrying relatively small cargoes while exposing themselves to great danger. The Kaiten program, the human torpedoes, represented the nadir of Japanese submarine operations. Young men, often barely out of their teens, volunteered or were pressured to volunteer for what were essentially suicide missions. They would climb into these tiny craft, be released from the submarine, and guide their torpedo toward an enemy ship, knowing they would perish in the explosion. It was a tactic born of desperation and reflected the militaristic fanaticism that had taken hold in Japan's leadership. The Kaiten achieved minimal success while wasting the lives of hundreds of young men. The story of Japan's submarines in World War II is ultimately a tragedy. Immense resources were poured into building these vessels. Thousands of men trained and served aboard them. Innovative technologies were developed, but due to flawed strategic decisions and the overwhelming power of their enemies, the submarine force achieved far less than it might have. By the time the war ended, the survivors were scattered across the Pacific, their submarines mostly destroyed, their service and sacrifices largely forgotten in the chaos of Japan's defeat. Today, historians continue to study Japanese submarine operations, trying to extract lessons and understand what went wrong. Naval enthusiasts are fascinated by the technical aspects of these vessels, particularly the unique designs like the I-400 class. And relatives of those who served search for information about their ancestors, hoping to understand what they experienced and how they died. The ocean keeps many secrets, and the wrecks of Japanese submarines are among them, silent memorials to a maritime force that fought bravely but unsuccessfully in a war their nation could not win. Thank you for watching this exploration of Japanese submarine operations in 1945 and the experiences of the men who served aboard these vessels. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future videos. And please share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement means everything to this channel and helps us continue to bring these important stories to light.